LQR is, I guess, like the optimality of finite horizon LQR or infinite horizon LQR with respect to our policy. So what we're doing is that we're solving for U. We want a K that gives us this feedback policy, and K is shaped like this. So K has the number of rows as control inputs and the number of columns as states. And so you see our policy U is a function of where we are in the state space. And with LQR, what we showed is because we made no assumptions when we did our derivation of LQR, this is optimal everywhere in the state space. So if I'm doing finite horizon LQR and I have a 10-step trajectory, nowhere in that Riccati recursion do I have to use any sort of state information. Everything I did there was just totally assuming that I could be anywhere in the state space. And it turns out that no matter where I am, as long as I apply this feedback policy, I will act optimally. So question 1 of the last homework was kind of showing this. It was saying that I was comparing solving a convex optimization problem where I'm setting everything up with my initial condition and solving it. That gives me one solution. And I do finite horizon LQR where I don't use any information about the state, about where I am. I just produce a bunch of gain matrices K, and I follow that. And it turns out that they both have the same trajectory. And kind of the whole power of LQR is that I can solve for these Ks totally agnostic to where I am in the state space, and it will always be optimal, which is not true if I solve these things using convex optimization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, got it. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, basically the component of K is different for different states. Yeah, I mean, get it.
Yeah, this is just a matrix. So,
Yeah.
and so what I was doing is that when I was showing those plots of the values of K changing, I just did like a simple, I'll vectorize K. And then stuff that looks like this. I'm not an artist, but I think you guys get the idea. I was just showing the elements of this matrix K as a function of the iteration in the Riccati recursion.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, cool. So now I'm going to do a quick run through of iLQR and DIRCOL. I'm going to talk about both these things. I know Zach's talked about them a bunch, but my idea for this recitation was I wanted to go through and talk about these things at a very high level. And then I was going to do a quick run through of some of the previous quizzes that some people have had some trouble on. And then after that, I'm going to do a run through on homework 3, which came out on Wednesday. And it's where you're going to use both these tools. So, and also as usual, any questions, feel free to stop me. And I'm sure we'll have some time at the end for just general questions if things aren't clear. So first, I'm talking about iLQR. So what iLQR does is actually, now that I think about this, I think it actually makes a little more sense to talk about DIRCOL first. So first, I'll talk about DIRCOL. And what DIRCOL does is it sets up your optimal control problem where I'm solving for a trajectory. And we're going to do all this optimization with a direct nonlinear programming solver. So that means is that like no more clever control stuff. I'm just setting up a big optimization problem and solving it. So I'll write down again our like standard traj-opt problem. X1 to n, U1, n minus 1. I'm going to have there's a lot of different notations you'll see for this. This seems to be a pretty standard one to have a stage cost. So this is terminal, term cost. This is the stage. So here's my cost function. I'm optimizing directly over all the states and controls in a finite horizon problem here. And then I'm minimizing this cost function, which broke it up into a terminal cost that applies to the last time step and a stage cost that applies to every time step that's not the last time step. And then I'm going to have some constraints here. So the first constraint that we always had is going to be the dynamics of our system. So such that x k plus 1 fk uk, and this is, I'll just say 4 equals 1 n minus 1. So this is our discrete time dynamics function. Discrete dynamics function. And then since I'm already solving this thing in a big solver where I can handle arbitrary constraints, I can also, I can feel free to put some x constraints, some like bound constraints on x. I can do the same thing on u. And then I can have also more general constraints. So I can say, any combination of g, which will just be some constraint function, g of ui, xi less than equal to 0. And then another constraint ui, xi equals 0. So what I've done here is that in a very general form, I've written down one of our trajectory optimization problems where we have all these variables that we're solving for, the x's and the u's, so the state and control histories for this finite time trajectory. And then I have my discrete time dynamics as a constraint. I can put bound constraints on u if I want to, or I can just put general constraints. So if you imagine that, like, if I had a terminal constraint that the final state x of n must be equal to some x goal, then I could fit that easily into a function that looked like that. If I had a weirder constraint where maybe I was like combining some x's and some u's in some nonlinear or linear fashion in some inequality sense, you could put that there. And so this is like, without any loss of generality, this is our like the canonical problem for us to solve these trajectory optimization problems. And so I'm going to take a moment to talk about what I think is like the hardest part of this to understand is the dynamics constraints. So it's important to note that when I constrain the dynamics of the system, what I mean is that I'm solving for a bunch of x's and a bunch of u's. Now, if we remember back to like the structure of these dynamics problems, all I need is an initial state in my controls, and I can back out my x's, right? Like if I were to give you, hey, I'm starting at x0, here's a sequence of my controls, you could do a simulation, you could roll out the trajectory, and you could recover all the x's. And so like a lot of people naively will be like, oh, well, this is redundant for us to solve for the x's and the u's. Let's just solve for the u's. And it turns out that this is, in terms of numerics and the optimization problem itself, is a really bad idea. And it results to very dense and ill-conditioned constraint Jacobians. And what I mean by that is that we kind of have this problem, like a little bit of the tail wagging the dog. So we have a ton of dependence on very early u's and very little dependence on the later u's. And so because it kind of gives more importance to different controls at different parts of the trajectory, that is a little bit of an explanation as to why like the numerical properties of this problem exist. And so as a general rule of thumb, if you're ever solving a traj-opt problem, and I'm using any kind of direct method, you should never use what they call the lifted form, which is just solving for the u's. You should always solve for the x's and the u's. And so if we're doing that, if we're solving for states and controls, then we need some way to communicate to the solver that these states and controls are constrained to be dynamically feasible. What that means is that if I do the same exercise where I give you the x naught, I give you the initial condition, and then I give you a bunch of controls, you should be able to do your own simulation and recover those x's, and they should be the same as the ones that I solved for. And so the way that we do that is we put a constraint in this problem that says that the x's and the u's, they must have this relationship. They must satisfy some discrete dynamics function. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'll write this out a little simpler. I'll write this out in two different flavors. And the point that I'm working towards right here is that when I write things out in this form, it doesn't matter what integrator I use. It doesn't matter if it's implicit or explicit. They both fit into this form just fine, which is why we end up using implicit integrators sometimes, because we can get a little more bang for our buck. So here is explicit integrator. I'll just do So this is just me rewriting my constraint. I just moved the xk plus 1 from the left side to the right side. So this is my, if I use an explicit integrator, I'll just write that. Explicit. Now, if you remember back to homework 1, we also did a bunch of stuff with these implicit integrators, which is where opposed to just having a function where I give it an x and a u and it spits out an x at the next time step, I'm now solving for x the next time step that satisfies some residual function, some relationship between x, u, and xk plus 1, so that that sequence of 3, such that some residual equals 0. And I can write that out as the following, if you remember. This is 0 equals f implicit. It's a function of xk, uk, xk plus 1 equals 0 for k equals 1 to n minus 1. So do you guys have some questions as to how we can kind of just swap out the explicit integrator for the implicit integrator? Maybe what I mean by this residual function. So actually, I'll do a very simple example of this. I'll show this with forward Euler and backward Euler. So if you remember forward Euler, so I'll do this example. Forward Euler, which is an explicit integrator, says the following. It just says that xk plus 1 equals xk plus dt times x dot of k. This is what forward Euler tells us. And so if I had to write this down as a dynamics constraint in the form where it's some equality constraint equals 0, I could just move this thing over. So this is how I write my forward Euler dynamics constraint. And then we had backwards Euler, which is implicit. Backwards Euler. Implicit. And this I write as I have the following like residual function. This tells me that xk plus dt times xk plus 1 minus xk plus 1. So it's a very important difference here, and that's in these terms right here. So with forward Euler, I'm taking the derivative information at time k and using that to propagate from time k to k plus 1. And in backwards Euler, I'm using the derivative information at k plus 1 and assuming that I know that to get from k to k plus 1. So here are the two most simple explicit and implicit integrators. And what I did is I wrote both these things out, and one of them, and I can write them both in a form that it's 0 equals some equality constraint. And the reason that when we simulate, it's easy to use explicit integrators is because to solve for this, I just have to plug in these values and I get that, and I get xk plus 1. Now for implicit integrators, remember I had to use Newton's method and I had to solve for what xk plus 1 is, knowing there's a dependence on it right here. So with implicit integrators, you have to use a root finding method like Newton's method to find what xk plus 1 is given your dynamics residual. That's what we call this thing right here. And for explicit, it's just a simple function where I give it an x, give it a u, it's going to spit out x the next time step. But then when we write everything out in this form, where we're writing a big optimization problem, and we just need to write some constraint and make sure that these x's and these u's follow our dynamics, we can see that it doesn't matter if I write explicit or implicit. Like one is not easier or harder for the solver to work with. They both just fit totally fine into these constraints because all we have to communicate is that we have dynamics present. So this I think is a super cool point because it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of the sort of integrator that we use in these problems. So what Zach talked about in class is all the direct collocation stuff. And if you remember, he was doing stuff with splines and he was talking about third order splines and he wrote everything out. So all that he was doing in class when he was writing the spline stuff was that is the exact same as us just using Hermite-Simpson as an implicit integrator. So if you remember from homework 1, question 1, we did all the integration and we did a bunch of implicit integrators. We did backwards Euler, implicit midpoint, and then Hermite-Simpson. So we did 3 implicit integrators. And with these 3, what we saw is that, we had different performance, and the higher order ones, so Hermite-Simpson, which is third order, looked better than implicit midpoint, which looked better than backwards Euler. So we showed the different accuracies that we get when we look at these implicit integrators. And so Hermite-Simpson just happens to be a nice third order implicit integrator. And when we use that, kind of one of the I guess the foundations that integrator is based on is that the solution is a cubic. And so all the stuff that Zach did in class, it's great for getting some more, I guess, a better visual understanding of what the implicit integrator is really doing. But I think it's important to know that in practice, when we go to write out everything he did in code and do it like in software package, that really all we want is that we want some way to write down our dynamics like this. And him doing all the spline stuff is his way of saying that he's just going to use Hermite-Simpson for this implicit integrator residual that we use in our constraint. Okay, so I know like at first when I saw the spline stuff, I was like a little thrown off. But it's just as simple as when I write down the constraint, I'm using Hermite-Simpson. That's all that means. Okay, so this is DIRCOL. So the idea is that we take this problem right here, and then we're going to just stack up. So I'll do. So we take that whole problem that we just described, and we're going to solve it in the following way. Solve with a nonlinear programming solver. IPOpt or SNOPT. These are the most 2 common and performant ones that you'll find. And the way that we do this is we're going to stack everything up in this z vector. So z equals x0, u0, x1, u1, dot, dot, x n minus 1, u n minus 1, x n. So remember that, when I wrote on this problem right here, this is an optimization problem in x's and u's, and these are like, vectors and vectors. And this is like a totally fine way in like a modeling language to write things down. But oftentimes we have to like solve things with a normal off-the-shelf solver where it wants to solve for one vector. It doesn't want to solve for like, these abstract shapes or matrices, or it just wants to solve for a vector. So that's fine for us. What we'll do is we'll just take all of our x's and u's, and we're going to stack them up into a big vector z. And then we're going to write this problem that just says, and I'll write this in the correct form that we'll see in the homework. Minimize z, sum cost function, subject to So we're minimizing some cost function is a function of our vector z. We have an equality constraint, and then we have an inequality constraint that we're going to write as a bound constraint. So c inic z is going to take in some z, produce another vector of values, and this vector has to be between these 2 bounds, c lower and c higher. Now, if you wanted a traditional constraint, we just had the normal inequality sense, like less than, I would just make one of these my less than number, and one of these like, actually, I'll write this out explicitly since this will come up. So imagine if I had this constraint, I can convert this to a bound constraint just by doing the following. So any constraint that I can write down like this, I can also write down as a bound constraint. And you may ask the question, well, why would we take this already general form and have to convert it to a new form? And the answer is it happens to be easier in some scenarios. So imagine if I was trying to constrain, the norm of the control must be between 3 and 10. Opposed to having 2 constraints in this form, I could just have 1 constraint in the bound form. So I'll give an example of this. So if I had, norm of x, so I'll do norm of u must be between like 10 and 5. If I had a problem like this, to write this in the normal constraint form, I'd have to do u less than or equal to 10, negative u less than or equal to -5. So I'd have to write this thing down as two constraints if I used this form, or if I just did thing in the bound form, I just have one constraint right here. So any constraint like this, I can easily convert into the bound form, no problem. And there's some constraints that are easier to write down in the bound form than they are in the normal form. So that just happens to be why we chose this as our interface to the solver.
Is it easier for the solver to solve it, or is it easier for convenient for us to write it?
So it's gonna be both. So in general, these solvers, it depends a lot on the sparsity of the problem. So how, if I take my constraint Jacobian, how many different variables are involved in each constraint? So it takes that into account, but also we want to reduce the number of constraints that we have. So if we have to add, twice as many constraints, this solver is going to take either a longer time or going to have more trouble numerically to solve it. Writing things down like this, it's fewer constraints, which is always better for the solver, and it's certainly better for us when it comes to communicating these constraints to the solver. Does that answer your question?
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Sweet. Okay, so we just set up a trad problem. We're now going to solve it with a nonlinear programming solver, and we did so by stacking up our x's and our u's into the z vector, and then we're writing out this like canonical NLP form that we'll use in the homeworks. And then I'll also put bound constraints on this. And what I'm saying here is that I have simple bound constraints on the x's and the u's. So any state and control constraints that are just linear bound. So like, u must be between -5 and 5, and the state x must be between like -10 and 10. I can put all those values right here. And I can have different upper and lower bounds. So imagine it the same thing as before where I have a normal constraint. So say x just has to be below 10. I would do x is below 10, but greater than -infinity. So what you'll do in your homework is that you'll go through and I'll give you a nice little indexing tool that will let you kind of convert from z's to x's. And what I'll do is that, if I gave you a z, I give you this indexing tool that helps you pick out, like, say I want u6, how to pick it out. And this won't quite make sense until you see your homework. But if you look back at this, it's always something like x of I equals z of I dx dot x. And this just stores the indices in which that xi takes place. So you'll use this in your question 1. Should be pretty straightforward. But basically, I gave you a tool such that you can pull out the states and controls that you want to from the stacked vector z. All right, so I think this is a good stop. Like, this is the direct collocation story. Super powerful. It's a great tool. It is generally very good at solving non-convex problems, but in general, I think we have to always remind ourselves that if we pose a non-convex problem, we run the risk of two things. One is that we're not guaranteed to find a feasible solution if one exists. So if I were to give it a really hard control problem that was, theoretically possible and there was a way to solve it, it's not guaranteed that IPOC is going to solve this problem, right? It's, in fact, if it's difficult, there's a high likelihood that it won't find any feasible trajectory that satisfies the constraints. So this is not true with convex problems. With convex problems, there's a solution out there. It'll find it. It'll find the global solution. For non-convex problems, the best we can hope for is a locally optimal solution that's feasible, so it satisfies our constraints. But we have no guarantee that we'll find this. And if for really hard problems, it'll have trouble finding one of these. So just know that we're kind of in like the Wild West of trad here. Like, we're setting up and solving these problems. And if they're really hard, like, we can't always expect a solution. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And I'll make more of a point of this when we go over the quizzes in a little bit, but there's a few other misunderstandings that people are having with this method. So one, it needs an initial guess. So, I mean, it could be all zeros, which would be a bad guess, but it needs some initial guess. Initial guess. And what we can do here is that we can warm start the solver by putting it into a basin of attraction that should be near our solution. So a good example of when this would be useful is that, imagine if I had, like a path planning kind of thing, and I had some room I had like a bunch of obstacles. What I could do is I could like, this is it was where we start, this is where we stop. I could initialize the solver with like a really naive thing here. This could be Z0. And then I could feed the solver with this description of the states and controls that move me from here to here, and they don't have to be dynamically feasible. So when I initialize this solver, my initial Z, so my initial X's and U's in my trajectory, it does not have to be a real trajectory. It can just be as close as I'd like it to be. And the closer it is to the solution, the solver will have an easier time and a better time providing you a better solution. So if I were to initialize this solver for this problem with an initial trajectory that looks something like this, it does not have to be dynamically feasible. So not feasible. And then I go into the solver would optimize, a really nice looking, or this would be Z star. So the optimal solution. So basically this solver is non-convex. Its convergence is going to be dependent on where we start the solver. So we want to start it somewhere close. And another great example of some way we do this is, imagine if I had a locomotion task. So I had a humanoid robot that was trying to like walk across the room. I don't know the controls that I can execute on this robot that will make it walk across the room, but I know the state history of it walking. So what I can do is I can initialize a solver with the X's that correspond to this humanoid walking across the room, and then as close as U's as I want to. And that should be in the general basin of attraction for the solver to start with that and then converge to a really good solution. But if I had to initialize it with just the controls, walking humans are very difficult. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to just think up a great controller to initialize a solver with. So DIRCOL is one of the great powers of it, is that I can initialize this solver with an arbitrary trajectory. It does not have to be dynamically feasible. Yeah, Sid, what's up?
The Z naught you've drawn is feasible, right?
Z is not. Oh, so let me write this out very. Yeah, this is a good point. Let me be explicit about this. Not dynamically feasible. So it does not have to satisfy our dynamic feasibility. So it doesn't have to be a real trajectory. It just has to. It can be something close. Does that make sense?
Right. And like, does it have to be sensible? Like, what if I gave it a reference trajectory that went through the obstacles?
So, I mean, you can do that. All this stuff is very problem dependent, but there's a bunch of good examples of relatively easy problems that if I initialize the solver well, it solves no problem. If I initialize it poorly, it won't solve it at all. And in fact, in your homework for question 3, if you use DIRCOL to solve it, you'll see that like having the initial guess is critical to getting this thing to work well. So you want your initial guess to be somewhere near what you think your solution will look like. And if you have, I guess, the domain specific knowledge to produce those initial guesses, it's critical and things will work much better than if you just have to arbitrarily start from scratch. Because like, as you said, like, this is like a pretty classic example, but if I have like an initial trajectory that goes this way, no matter how I optimize, this thing will never switch to the other side of the obstacle. Right. But if I were to start my initial thing here, it would like pretty much be guaranteed the solution would be like this way, the obstacle. So where you initialize this is going to have a huge effect on where it converges to, because for a non-convex problem, there are many local optima. So depending on where we start, we could solve any number of locally optimal trajectories. And we want the best one. So we want to initialize it with like what we think makes the most sense. So what we think is like the basin of attraction for the best local optima, the solution that we really want.
That makes sense. Got it. Is there any difference between like feasibility and dynamic feasibility in this example?
Yeah, so feasibility just means in general satisfies all of the constraints. Dynamic feasibility just means satisfies the dynamics constraints. So we look at our problem up here. We wrote down all these constraints. So if my Z or my trajectory, X and U's. I have all my X's and U's. If these things are feasible, it means it satisfies all of these constraints. If it's dynamically feasible, it just means it's a real trajectory. Like if I execute all the U's, I get all the X's. And that just means it satisfies the dynamics constraints. So this is dynamic feasibility. This is general feasibility.
Got it. Thank you.
One quick question for I get for X, like what we are doing for EU, like initializing U. Is it a good practice to run it like the real robot using a controller, like RC controller, and then recording the controls and then form starting, or how
Yeah.
does it?
Yeah, that is that would be a great way to start the solver. I'll give you a very simple example for this. So if I had a quad rotor problem to solve, I know how much the quad rotor weighs, and I know the amount of thrust I need to keep this thing lifting. So I would initialize it with my initial controls would be like the hovering controls. And if you imagine if I had just had all zeros for my guess, the quad rotor, my best guess to start the problem is the quad rotor just like falling and hitting the ground, which is a bad guess. So if I can initialize that with the U's, you could do something as sophisticated as what you described, which is where we take some expert demonstration and initialize a solver with that. That would, be amazing, but it's not always possible to do that. It's maybe like based on like your methods for data collection, or you don't have an expert on hand. It's a really hard control problem. It may not be possible to do that, but there's still advantageous things we can do when we come to a warm starting a use. And a good example would be the quad rotor. Starting it with the hovering controls would just like generally lead to a better solution than if I just started it with nothing. And like the solver would have to start with the quad rotor just hitting the ground and then solve towards a better trajectory. Or if I can help it by like getting as close as possible, the hover is a pretty good start. Does
All
that
right,
make
got it.
sense?
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Sweet. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We'll talk about iterative LQR. So iterative LQR, this is it can solve a strict subset of problems that we solve with DIRCOL. So with DIRCOL, I know I didn't make any assumptions. I just said, use an explicit or implicit integrator, put whatever crazy constraints you want to, but just know the problem is non-convex. With iLQR, I'm still solving non-convex problems, but it's of a very specific form. So it's I'll just do some copying here. So it's of this form. Okay, so if my problem looks like this, also, I always forget to write this out, but I have some initial condition. So I will go add this to DIRCOL because it is not there. All right, so this is our initial condition constraint. Right here, that just means that we start where we currently think we should start. So here for iLQR, the assumption is that I have some cost function that is the same, I have a terminal cost and a stage cost. I have an initial condition, and I'm going to have a dynamic constraints that look like the following. And for iLQR, it has to be an explicit integrator. It doesn't, I guess I should be more careful. There are ways to do iLQR with an implicit integrator, but it involves using the implicit function theorem to compute R Jacobians, which is we're not going to do it in this class. It's totally possible. So in theory, with iLQR, you can use explicit or implicit integrators. It is 10 times more common to use explicit integrators. So we'll make a note. So 99% of the time. Explicit integrators. implicit is possible, though. So while we can do implicit integration for this, it's a way more common to do explicit integration. So what we're saying is that if we set up our traj-opt problem and it happens to look like this, I don't have to use DIRCOL and use an NLP solver. I can use iLQR. And if that's the case, it's generally easier to use iLQR. It happens to be a little bit faster. And there's actually one other benefit that I'll talk about in a sec. But so if I have this, if this is my traj-opt problem, I can solve it with iLQR, and that will give me the following. So say I just have some just generic routine, or I do, I have some function, and you'll do this on your homework. So X initial condition, U guess, and then I'll do, the function F, function L. So with iLQR, and you'll go and do this in your homework, but all we can do is we can start with our initial condition and then a guess trajectory on the U's. So this is where there's a huge difference between this and DIRCOL. With DIRCOL, I could initialize states and controls, only states, only controls. I could initialize the solver however I wanted to. So any domain-specific knowledge that I had as to what the solution to this problem would be, I could just start the solver near there, and I'm off to a good start. With iLQR, I'm limited to, I can only initialize the controls. So this is totally fine for some problems. For some problems, it's much more difficult. So the example I talked about before, where we have a humanoid trying to make like bipedal locomotion work with the traj-opt solver, it's very hard to think of a U guess that's going to make the robot walk across the room, right? That's like the whole point of us doing this, is that we want to figure out how to do that. So we can't start with like a good looking walking trajectory with just U's. I would need to know all the controls that make the robot do that. And that's kind of the whole point. So there's some times where the U guess is very tricky to produce something good. But there's other times, like for a quad rotor, having it just hover is like totally fine. But it's worth noting that amongst these two methods for solving traj-opt problems, with iLQR, we are limited to only solving these things, or only initializing these things with a guess trajectory on the controls U. And then what we get is that it's going to solve for our optimal X, optimal U. And again, this is locally optimal. This is still a non-convex problem. This can still fail to find a solution. So it's assuming everything goes well to solve this non-convex problem, we find a local minima. It's going to return the locally optimal X and U, and then it will also return K. And what this K is that this is our time variant LQR gain. So this is TV LQR gains about X star, U star. So, something cool about iLQR is that when we solve this problem, not only do we get a solution, but we also kind of for free, we're going to get a K out of there as well. So, we solve the problem, we get our trajectory, and then we also get our time variant LQR gains. So if we wanted to track this thing online with like some model mismatch, which you guys have done in the homework a few times, I don't have to go out and compute the TV LQR gains again. I can just use the Ks that came from the solver. So that is like another benefit. In general, Zach did a lecture where he kind of did like the pros and cons of DIRCOL versus iLQR and DDP. And I feel that stuff personally is like super important to understand, because that's kind of like conversationally what you would need in like an interview, for instance. Both these tools, understanding the pros and cons, when you use one or the other, having kind of like built them up from scratch yourself. So that kind of stuff I think is like a really important takeaway from the class, because it is like to exist, just to have like the conversational literacy with optimization and optimal control. Understanding those two methods, how they fit in with each other, when to use one versus the other is super important. So if you haven't quite gotten a hold of that and like have had some trouble on the quizzes, I would definitely go through and either watch that lecture with him again, or just look at the notes where he writes everything out. So that is the iLQR story. And then let's see what else. So we have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to do a quick run through of the homework. And then as always, feel free to jump in with questions.
One question, Kevin.
Mhm.
From an implementation perspective, so if we want to follow a reference with the gains of DIRCOL, so you basically have like these gains stored somewhere in your hardware, and then just call them like a lookup table when you need them to follow this reference.
Exactly. Yeah. So in practice, how this would work is that for any trajectory tracking problem, if I do TVLQR, I'm going to have a bunch of gains, and each gain is going to be specific to that time step. So I have a control gain K1 for time step 1, K2 for time step 2. So I'm going to hold on to all these on the robot, and then it's going to be, time step 5, and I'll get the state estimate in from the controller. I'll go grab K5 and I'll do U equals negative KX. That'll produce my U, and I'll send the U out to the motor commands. And that's something that you have to store on the robot, or there's other you can store it wherever you want to, but that's information that the robot will need in order to act optimally while it tracks.
Okay.
All right, so here I'm going to do a quick run through of the homework. And so the reason why I structured these things the way I did in this lecture is because I wanted to do DIRCOL first to show just in general what a numerical trash-opt problem looks like. And then to talk about how if our problem only fits into this category, if it doesn't have normal constraints, if it only has dynamics constraints, I can use iLQR. And so what you'll do in this homework is you'll do both these things. So you'll start with DIRCOL. And what we talk about is that normally interfacing with these NLP solvers can be a little tricky. So I wrote like an fmincon wrapper for this. And so here's the standard form that I talked about for NLPs that we're going to be using in this class. And your job is to take traj-opt problems in the DIRCOL way that we just described and convert them into a normal NLP that looks like this. And so you'll have a little bit of practice. So we talk about how this is the form itself, cost function, equality constraint, inequality bound on the primal variables. So X, this is our primal variable. And so first thing we'll do is we'll take a linear program, and you'll just, using that same trick before, where if I have an inequality, g of x is less than or equal to h, this is the same as g of x is less than h, but greater than any negative infinity. So we're going to take this LP, we're going to convert it into this NLP format and solve it just to get an idea of how these things work. And then the next thing is we're trying to take this cart pull, and we're trying to do the cart pull swing up. So you've probably seen this. This is on OpenAI Gym. This is like a super common RL task. And it's pretty amazing how well we can solve this with our model-based optimal control tools. So even kind of state-of-the-art RL algorithms can take minutes of training to solve this problem. And we can solve this thing pretty easily. So we have a cart pull, and it's going to start at the down position. So the cart and the pole is going to be at the down position. And we want to find some way to move this thing to swing the pole to the up position. And so we write down this problem where we say, okay, we have some goal pose that we're looking for, and then we're going to have just a quadratic penalty on any of the U's. So we have a normal LQR cost function. We have an initial condition, so we have to say that it's going to start with the pull down, and then I have a goal constraint. And this is where I'm saying all right, the last state must be my goal state. So this cost is just to give me a nice looking trajectory. But in there, I have a hard constraint that says you must, at the last piece, you must satisfy this. And remember, this is one of the constraints. It's like a generic constraint that I can include in DIRCOL that I can't put in iLQR. And then I have my dynamics constraints, which is my Hermite-Simpson residual. So if you forget this, feel free to look back at homework 1, question 1. We did all the inputs integration. So here's our Hermite-Simpson F equals 0. So it must be dynamically feasible with respect to the Hermite-Simpson integrator. And then I'll put some control bounds on U. And what we're doing is that, here is the ODE. So dynamics, this is where I take in X and U, I output X dot. And then here's where you're going to put the Hermite-Simpson implicit integrator residual. So again, this is homework 1, question 1. The only difference is that now we have a U, which is super easy. It just means that when I call for X dot, opposed to doing X dot as a function of just X, now it's a function of X and U. So here's Hermite-Simpson with the control U, should be straightforward. Here's how we stack up our vector z. This is what we're actually going to solve for when we form this problem. Remember, like we stack everything up, and then I use this create IDX function, and it's just going to go through and it's going to store all the indices of where all those x's and u's are within z. It's going to store them in a nice format, so I can go grab x of 5, x of 10, whatever. I can grab whatever variable I want to because I have the locations of all of them stored in this IDX. And then I also have the constraint that u must be between -10 and 10. And so here what I'll do is like you'll put in your cost function. Here you can put in your stacked dynamics constraints. And so I'll put a bunch of like skeleton code in here just so you can get it working. The idea is that we just take all these constraints, stack them all up, because remember, it has to be a big constraint vector. And then I can also have some equality constraints, and this is going to be everything. This will be my initial condition constraint, my terminal condition constraint, and all my dynamic constraints. These are all equality constraints. And I'm going to have some inequalities too. So I have like, inequality constraints. I have to find some way to encode any inequality constraints in there. For this problem, I don't have any that aren't bound constraints. So if you remember, if we look at this form that we have right here, we have primal bound constraints. So this is a way for us to write down any limits on x and u in a simple way without writing a generic inequality constraint function. And so while we have u should be in between -10 and 10, I don't have to use a generic inequality constraint. I can just get away with just using the primal bound constraint because it's a simple bound constraint. No need to write a function for it. And so you'll write all that up, get that working. And then one thing to note is that there's two different ways to compute the derivatives that the IPHOP solver is going to need. So the first way is using auto diffing. So this is with forward diff. The second way is with finite diffing, which is slower and less accurate, but it will work like there's no specific finite diff not bugs, but issues in your code that would prevent you from using it. So if you remember from homework 0, there's a few things you have to be careful of when you use forward diff. Finite diff, it'll just work always. So I gave you the option to use both. You should try and use forward diff. And if that doesn't work, then use finite diff as like a last resort. But both are going to be fast enough that you'll solve these problems relatively quickly. And then we'll go and we'll solve fmin con. This is the whole doc string for the function here. Here you include all the information about the problem, solve it, and then we can pull out the x's and the u's from our z's, just like this. And then we'll do some cool animations. The next thing we'll do is that we're going to track this DIRCOL solution with time variant LQR. And so we did exactly this on question 2, part B of homework 2. So yeah, the last homework, second question, we did the cart pole swing up. The first thing was trying to stabilize about the top. Second thing was I gave you a swing up trajectory and I told you to track it. So now we're gonna do the same exact thing, but we've created, like I'm no longer handing you a trajectory. You solved using DIRCOL for a swing up, and now you're gonna track it with TVLQR. So this should be extremely similar to question 2, part B of the previous homework. And even though we used Hermite-Simpson and DIRCOL, when we do the simulation, we'll just use RK4, and for this accuracy for this problem, it's totally fine to like use whichever one you want to. And then also make sure to clamp your U's such that they're between 10 and -10. Because remember, these are our control constraints. So it doesn't matter what's happening on the real robot. I can't actuate anything more than these values. So I can enforce this explicitly during the simulation. This is question 1. Question
I have
2.
a quick question about question 1, part A.
Yeah.
So we don't have any primal bound constraints. And then you mentioned in the part B that if we have no inequality constraints, there's a way to deal with it. If we have no primal bound constraints, what do we do?
So we just say that, so x must be between xl and xu. I make xu a vector of infinities and xl a vector of negative infinities.
Okay, and how do you, what's the syntax for infinity?
Oh,
Is it just, okay, capital I,
Yeah.
okay.
so you'll do something like this.
Lowercase I, got it.
And this is a good point. I'm going to add this to the homework because people might not know that. But yeah, use inf. It's totally fine to throw an inf in a solver. And it's capital I. And thank you for noting, that's definitely worth putting in this homework. So I'll go and update that.
And then for the constraints, so if you scroll up, it's like AX equals B.
Mhm.
You're essentially in the function you're returning AX, and then how would you? I think I need to look at.
There are
Oh,
a few
actually, I
ways to
think
do this. You should
Okay.
do, so look at our equality constraints. We must have some constraint equals 0, right? So let's move
Okay.
this B to the left-hand side. So our constraint, C of X, will be AX minus B. And I say that must be equal to 0.
Okay, got it. And then for the inequality, we use the CL and CU to sort of create everything, right?
Exactly, yeah. So now for inequality, so yeah, there's two ways to do this. So one way is I could do G of X as my C inequality, and then C upper would be H, and C lower would be my
Infinity.
minus infinity. I could do that, or I could also just take the H to the other side, have G of X minus H is less than or equal to 0, and then just change those bounds accordingly. But so do whatever you want to. You'll still find the solution. Should be pretty straightforward. But
Okay, got it.
this experiment was, you were trying to go through and like understand how to take constraints that look like X and make them look like Y.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sweet. So now question 2, I'll run through this pretty quickly.
Yeah, one quick point in question 1, Kevin. I
Mhm.
have already done question 1, and at the beginning I was having some trouble to understanding which was the element type of the returning of every of the inequality and equality constraint functions, because actually what you are doing is like the equality constraints, for example, is AX minus B, but I didn't know if I had to compute the equal 0 in the function, or if I have to just return AX minus B, and then the function or the function that you are giving us will take care of the equal 0. So after a lot of mistakes, I understood that we have to output AX minus B, and then the solver will do the equal 0.
Exactly,
So,
yeah. So
yeah,
all you're doing is you're writing this function. You're not writing the full constraint. You're writing just
Yeah.
the function.
Yeah. So as I comment, I think it will be helpful, like to know which is the element type of the output in the doc string that
Okay.
every function has to output. So I mean, we don't have to go into the details of the function that you're providing to understand what's going on with the mistakes, with the errors.
Sweet. Okay. That is totally reasonable and makes sense, and I'll add it into the homework right now. All right, so now question 2, we're going to do a quadrotor, a 6th quadrotor with a position, a velocity, a modified Rodriguez parameter, which is just a 3-parameter attitude, and then our angular velocity omega. And we have this discrete dynamics function. And remember, I said that iLQR most of the time is going to be an explicit integrator. And so we're just, we're using RK4. Here we have our control problem. We say that, again, iLQR solves problems that look like this. And then I just say, here's what our stage cost is. Here is the terminal cost. And then we have our dynamics that we just wrote above. And I worked up a pretty cool reference trajectory. So it's going to have you do this weird like figure 8 kind of thing that's skewed a little bit. And your job is going to be to fill in all these functions. And you kind of have 2 options. One option is go through and fill all these functions in. Use this framework. This is like highly encouraged, but you don't have to use anything I provided if you don't want to. All you have to do is you have to use, you have to write this function such that the outputs are x, u, k, tvec params. So write it however you want to. I would strongly suggest you use the template I gave you, but don't feel like if you can't make it work or you don't understand why something is the way it is, you can use other stuff, but it would just be much easier for us to help you if you use the template. And yeah, so we'll just go through these again. Stage cost, term cost, stage cost expansion, just return all the derivatives of the stage cost, term cost expansion, backwards pass, cost of the trajectory, forward pass. iLQR is going to do everything to solve this problem. And the termination criteria is that delta J is less than or equal to some ATOL, which is our absolute tolerance. And create reference. This is where I create like the weird shape that we're going to track. And yeah, and then again, so both these problems we're solving for a trajectory, and then we're trying to run it online with a robot that's a little bit different. And this is very common because, like, we can only do so much modeling in sim. When we run this thing on a robot, there's going to be some sim to real gap. And so in both these problems, I show how to take our solution and then run it on a slightly different model. And again, like I said, this iLQR is the same as our time variant LQR. So we get that out for free. And so we'll do the same thing as before, where we'll track our trajectory given slightly different model parameters. So model real is going to have a slightly different set of values for our dynamics model. All right, any questions on either homework 3 or just general DIRCOL versus IPOPT, or sorry, DIRCOL versus iLQR kind of stuff? Sweet. In that case, I'll end the recording and I will see you all next week.
Oh, are we not covering question 3?
Oh, you're right. Question 3 is, I'll go through it super quick. So question 3 is, you can do both these things. So you just have to make these quadrotors reorient themselves. So they just have to move around, and they can't go within 0.8 meters of each other. And the idea is that we taught you how to use these 2 tools for questions 1 and question 2, but you can use whatever you want to. So you could use iLQR, you could use DIRCOL. There's other clever ways you could use neither of them and use something else if you wanted to. But there's many different ways to solve this. They will all work, but you need to like work at each of them to make them work. So you have to use kind of like create your own costs, create your own constraints, do whatever you want to. And there's just a few performance requirements you have to meet. So they are, we have an initial condition, they will almost start there. You must finish within 0.2 meters of your goal states, and no quadrotors should ever go 0.8 meters to each other. So satisfy these 3 however you want to. I did it with IPOPT. I did it with DIRCOL in the solution, but you can always do whatever you want to. And I mentioned that you can do cost shaping, so I can give them all unique reference trajectories to try and track this if I wanted to, or I could write down collision constraints and I could optimize all 3 of those motions at once. And I could directly constrain the norms of the distance between them to be greater than 0.8. And there's a few tips and tricks here. So norm greater than R, you should never use norm, just a normal norm in a constraint. You want to use norm squared. And the reason why is because norm squared is differentiable everywhere, even at 0. It's like a bowl. And norm is like a cone, it's like a point. And so it's non-differentiable at the bottom. And then if you want to initialize this solver, we're going to use a method that would be nice is to use linear interpolation between some start and goal states. And you can always use range to do this. I kind of gave a quick little rundown as to how we might go about doing that. And then feel free to use RK4 or Hermite-Simpson, just as long as you follow dt equals 0.2 and TF equals 5. You can change these, but if you're changing these, it probably means you've done something wrong. It is entirely possible to solve this using just all the given stuff. All right, so sorry for going a few minutes over, but I think that's gonna wrap it up now. So let me